Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Hudson Library special virtual event with Sara Gay Forden, author of The House of Gucci, a true story of murder, madness, glamour, and greed. My name is Kelsey, and I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Before we begin, please know that tonight's program is just one of our many, many programs at the Hudson Library. For a full lineup of our events with detailed information and links to register, please visit our website at hudsonlibrary.org. We will be accepting audience questions during the second half of tonight's program. If at any time you have a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. And we will make sure we get through as many of them as we can tonight. Now, I would like to introduce tonight's speakers. Sara Gay Forden covered the Italian fashion industry from Milan for more than 15 years, chronicling the explosion of labels, including Gucci, Armani, Versace, Prada, and many more, from the small brands into the mega brands they're known as today. She is now based in Washington, D.C. with Bloomberg News, leading a team that covers the challenges faced by big technology companies. Sara's book, House of Gucci, as many of you probably know, has been made into a soon-to-be-released motion picture starring Lady Gaga and Adam Driver. I'm sure she'll have plenty to share about that tonight. Sara is joined in conversation tonight with Teri Agins. Agins is an award-winning journalist, lecturer, consultant, and former senior special writer at the Wall Street Journal, where she developed the paper's fashion industry beat, of which she covered for more than 25 years. She's also the author of 2 books, including Hijacking the Runway, How Celebrities Are Stealing the Spotlight from Fashion Designers, and The End of Fashion, How Marketing Changed the Clothing Business Forever. Just so you're aware, copies of House of Gucci are available for purchase, courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookshop, The Learned Owl. We will add a link in the chat for easy purchase. Now, please join me in offering a warm welcome. Sara, Teri, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great to be here and have such an enthusiastic and numerous audience.
Yeah, okay, so let's take it away. All right, Sara and I go way back. When Sara came out with The House of Gucci, well, actually, this was my first book, The End of Fashion, had been out for about a year. And so Sara sent me the copies of the galleys of House of Gucci, and she wanted me to write a blurb for the back cover. And so when I got it, I was really excited. And then as soon as I tore into it, starts out with the big murder. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be juicy. And I tore through the book in maybe 2 or 3 sittings, and I was really excited. And now 20 years later, this is now a major motion picture. Sara's book is back. And Sara's book, The House of Gucci, has been reissued, which you guys will see. You see right here, there is a bullet hole in the new cover, which I think is kind of cool. And it is also now a New York Times bestseller, which is really pretty exciting. So anyway, we're gonna have a talk tonight. We're gonna talk about everything about the industry and what's going on. But first, Sara is just back from Europe. She was there on the red carpet at the premiere in London. So Sara, we wanna hear everything. We wanna hear about Lady Gaga and how was it to see your book, interpreted on the big screen. And so just take it away.
Oh, wow. Well, so first of all, thank you, Teri. Teri has been a mentor since those early days, and she is one of these wonderful people in the world who believe in what goes around, comes around, goes around, and she really gives back. And so Teri has helped guide me along the way in my exploration as a journalist and as an author. So it's great to be here now and sharing this moment. And I have to say that it's really kind of an out-of-body experience. As I was saying earlier when we were chatting, writing a book is a very solitary experience in many ways. And you have a lot of time, just you and your computer, you and your research, trying to sort through it, trying to find the narrative, trying to find compelling ways to tell, share all the information that you've gathered. And in the case of The House of Gucci, I really felt that it's an epic tale. I mean, all of these events happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but they stand for really big themes and issues about family dysfunction, greed, competitiveness, and how we deal with one another. And you can't you can't really pick the family that you have. You have to learn to love your family and live with your family. And so I think that one reason why this story has kind of caught fire so many years later is just because of this timeless element of the narrative. And now we have a director of the caliber of Ridley Scott and a cast, with a passionate cast with, top tier actors, really putting their all into their roles. And as you get to see the film, you'll see that it's different. It's a different way of interpreting these themes than my book did. And Ridley Scott has talked about how he's also tried to add, and also the screenplay writer tried to add some levity, some satire, because if you didn't, the story would be so dark that it might actually be really difficult to see, because these themes are very tragic. But I am just back. I'm in the middle of the red carpet extravaganza. I was in London for the worldwide premiere at the famous Odeon Cinema in Leicester Square, and they had a fabulous red carpet where all the stars walked in, and all the fans were out and cheering, and you saw Lady Gaga waving her amazing purple butterfly dress, which was a Gucci number. And Jared Leto and Al Pacino wasn't there, but Jeremy Irons and the others. And then last night in New York, at the Rose Theater at Lincoln Center, another iconic venue. And tomorrow night is the second US premiere in LA at the Academy Museum. So this has been kind of totally kicking up my usual daily, weekly schedule into a completely different kind of swirl, but it's been very exciting.
Yeah, so how was it to see your, as you said, this is an interpretation, but you were there in the theater. Had you seen the movie before?
Last night was the third time that I've seen the movie. So I had a private screening in Washington, D.C. with my mom, my 91-year-old mother, who was my editor, who she edited every single line in the book. And it was so wonderful that she was able to see it with me. And we talked through, we had a nice little dinner afterwards and talked through sort of what the movie says and how it says it. So it was great.
Wow. And your daughter was here too, right?
And my daughter was with me in London. So I actually dedicated the book to Julia, who was 3 when I started writing it. And the reason I did that was that I wanted her to understand, as she grew up, why her mom was so distracted when she was a toddler. Because as Teri well knows, when you're writing a book, it's kind of all right here. And it's very hard to just kind of get through the tasks of daily living. And so even like cooking a pasta, for a 3-year-old was a challenge.
Yeah. Sara, since we're talking about the book tonight, I wanted you to rewind and tell us, okay, we are all journalists. Sara was working at Women's Wear Daily in Milan. I was working with the Wall Street Journal at this time. Okay, she decides she's taking a leave of absence to write this book. Now, as you can imagine, because there's a murder, you can imagine that not just fashion, right? Everybody was interested in covering this story. So tell us how, this whole adventure of you're deciding to do this. How did you get access to Patrizia, who was arrested for murdering, or were actually arrested for arranging the murder, hiring a hitman to murder her ex-husband? So explain to us how that whole sequence, how that started.
So in the early days of the story, I was just covering it as a beat reporter for Women's Wear Daily. And I was primarily a business reporter, as Teri was too. So we were not covering sort of the latest, colors and styles. We were really covering, what's selling, what isn't, what are the business strategies of these iconic brands. And the hook that kind of grabbed me into the story was when Maurizio Gucci had a press conference back in 1991 about how he had just taken over. He had launched a stealth campaign to buy up his relatives because he couldn't afford to buy out their 50% of the business. He had a new financial partner, Investcorp, and he was in charge, and he was going to relaunch Gucci, which in those years had been kind of cheapened through over licensing. And it was the GG canvas, it was toilet kits, it was coffee mugs, it was even scotch bottles. It was like every member of the family seemed to have their own licensing deal. and the brand had totally lost its way. And so I was covering his projections for how he was going to relaunch Gucci. And then I started hearing from sources that this plan was failing miserably. And he had cut out all the cash cows, but the revenue from the new, more expensive products hadn't kicked in, and the company was in a cash crunch. It was close to bankruptcy. People were leaving. It was a very, very dire situation. So I started to get drawn in just as a beat reporter, business reporter on this sort of big brand that was going south. And it wasn't until several years later, after Maurizio had been killed, lots of spoilers in here, Patrizia had been arrested, and Tom Ford and Domenico De Sole had started turning Gucci around, that I saw, oh, there's a narrative here, and it's the kind of a rise and fall and rise again. And so that's when I got the idea. I had always wanted to write a book. I'm a journalist. I deal in facts, not fiction, and I needed kind of a nonfiction topic that was going to be, deep enough and meaty enough to just justify a book. And I realized that Gucci probably was going to be that book.
So did you know that you knew that, of course, the murder was going to be only part of it, but certainly a juicy part. How did you know you were going to be able to talk to Patrizia? Because I think you all did correspond. Can you explain that a little about that?
Absolutely. So actually the big challenge that I had was I had sources in the more recent fashion turnaround. I would talk to De Sole, I'd talk to Tom Ford, I'd talk to Don Mello, and they had all agreed to help me. But it was more challenging to get the Gucci side of the story. And at that point, many of the protagonists were dead. And Patrizia was in jail. So, how was I going to reconstruct this sort of important family history? And I managed to get to Maurizio's two cousins, Roberto and Giorgio. Roberto was in Florence and Giorgio was in Rome. And they had been, very active in the family business until they were bought out by Maurizio. And they agreed to talk to me. So I got a lot of the family history from them. I got a lot of the family history also from De Sole, because he had been there for the longest period of time. He started out as Rodolfo's lawyer in the 80s when these family battles were just starting, early 80s. He then became the president of Gucci America, and then became the CEO of the Gucci group that led, the takeover battle and ended up leading Gucci into the sort of world of multi-brand luxury. And then Patrizia, I requested interviews with her several times. She was at this point in jail, and the Italian prison authorities wouldn't let me interview her. They were afraid she was going to use, the press as a mouthpiece. And so I was like, what am I going to do? I really need her side of the story. And I did have an earlier interview that I had done when I was doing articles for W Magazine, and she had called up and said she wanted to talk, and she gave a long kind of scathing interview, just smearing Maurizio when she was very angry at him. She kind of launched a whole campaign against him in the media. So we never published that article, but I had my notes from all of that. And then I wrote to her in jail, and she wrote me back, and we had a prison correspondence in which she talked about her early years with Maurizio and how they had really truly loved each other. And then how she said something like he was the man who she loved most, even though he, had disappointed her.
Okay, now, did you all remember that Sara has lived in Italy for 15 years or so. So you did all this in Italian, correct?
All of this was in Italian, yes. Yeah, I was in Milan from 1988 to 2010. So actually 22 years, although not all of that covering the fashion industry.
Yeah, so this is pretty exciting. So you're having this correspondence. Now, the other thing is that when you were talking about Patrizia, you all have to think about Lady Gaga when you go see the movie, because she's the one who's playing this role. And I think they said that she was kind of like an Elizabeth Taylor type. I mean, that was, very flamboyant. So give us a little flavor of that.
Yeah, so in those years, actually, the Gucci dynasty was kind of compared to, the soap operas of the time, Dallas and Dynasty. And Patrizia actually really resembled both Joan Collins and Elizabeth Taylor. So there were many parallels. Well, now, everybody's watching Succession, but these are still the same themes, which is why I'm saying these themes really kind of, grab us and draw us in.
Mhm.
And so
Now-
Patrizia was kind of known, in the Milan social firmament as, the celebrity wife. She had a chauffeur car drive her around Milan. She wore Chanel and Yves Saint Laurent suits, and yet she was really an outsider. And I think this is kind of, to me, one of the compelling parts of the story, which is that people don't realize that the Milanese social sort of industrial elite is actually a very closed circle. And it was in those years very much about old money and old wealth. And, Patrizia was viewed as somebody coming from the other side of the tracks. And she, landed herself, in, the center of this, well-known Italian name, but even Gucci at the time wasn't really kind of inside that inner circle. And it wasn't even in Milan, in the years of the explosion of the designer brands like Armani and Versace. Gucci wasn't really a frontline player in those years.
Mhm. But Gucci started, Gucci's a 100-year-old brand, folks. So it's been around for years and years. And I remember when I think of Gucci, I think of Jackie Onassis with Jackie Kennedy, because of the Jackie handbag that was a Gucci handbag. And also, and I think of Sammy Davis Jr. and all those guys who wore the horse bit Gucci loafer. And that was what we all thought of. And then of course, with the stripes and the GG print. And that's what we thought about. And so it was, but position it before the whole licensing boom, Gucci was considered, it was it a brand like Louis Vuitton? I want you to kind of give people a sense of where it started at one point and then turned into what it was in the 80s, 90s, and then, and so forth.
Well, that's a really good question and good point, Teri, because that was kind of the turning point for Maurizio. So Gucci had been a top tier leather goods brand. It wasn't even that known for its apparel, but it was really known for its quality craftsmanship. And Aldo, Maurizio's uncle, used to say, quality is remembered long after price is forgotten. That was his motto. And he had little leather plaques, embossed in gold letters placed around the store, emphasizing that point. And that really came from Gucci's roots, from Guccio Gucci, who established it as a quality leather goods firm. And yet it wasn't, when I rethink about the history, it hadn't really acquired the status of an Hermes. And I think when Maurizio came on the scene and took over, and he wanted to relaunch it, and he used to say that he wanted to be kind of at the level of his father and his grandfather. He actually was aiming even higher, because Hermes was really the top of the luxury good pyramid, and he wanted Gucci to rival that for Italy, that, what Hermes represented for France.
Mm-hmm. So now, where was Ferragamo in this at that particular time? Because they were around the same.
Ferragamo was also kind of an up and coming brand, but they were really pretty much exclusively a shoemaker at that time. And, they later developed the handbags and the ready to wears, as all these brands kind of rounded out their product offerings. But Ferragamo was the shoes. Pucci was another big name at the time. And Pucci and Gucci were the first Italian brands to establish stores in New York. And so it was kind of known as the Gucci Pucci set.
Yeah, so that was the heyday. And then, and as I said, with Jackie Kennedy, she wore the Gucci shoulder bag for years, and that was almost like and when I'm thinking of in Paris, the French brand. Help me out.
Louis Vuitton or Hermes?
No, the one the status handbag, the Kelly bag, exactly.
Oh, Hermes, the Kelly bag.
That was a Kelly bag of its time.
Right, and so in fact, going back to kind of the sort of the celebrities who kind of made the name for these brands, before Jackie, the Gucci sort of references were Isabella Rossolini and Grace Kelly. And so one of these stories about one of the Gucci icons was how Grace Kelly came to the Milan store for a visit, and Rodolfo Gucci, who was Maurizio's father, shows her around the store in Via Monte Napoleone, which is sort of Italy's golden shopping triangle. And as she leaves, he presents her with the bamboo handled bag, which is kind of the classic Gucci handbag with the round. And you'll see that in the movie because it becomes contentious. And she demurs and says, no, it's too much. Just give me something simple. And he says, well, what would you like? And she said, well, maybe a scarf. And at that moment, he realized that Gucci actually didn't have a scarf, any scarves that he felt were suitable for a princess. And so he gives her that bag anyway. And then as soon as she's gone, he rushes and he calls an artist who he had worked with in the past, Vittorio Accornero. And he says, I need a design for a scarf fit for a princess. And I want it to be a cornucopia of flowers. And that's when Accornero designs what becomes the Flora scarf. And he produces it. It's absolutely gorgeous, stunning. And then Rodolfo packages it up and sends it off to Grace Kelly. And that's how the Flora, which is one of the major icons of the brand, was created.
Wow! So that was an exciting time. Okay, so now, but this was I'm thinking of all the fashion brands in Italy. These are all family businesses. Versace, the Gucci's. I mean, and explain Prada. I mean, this is all these different these layers of family people, and they're all into making great quality. I mean, made in Italy has always been such a badge of honor in the fashion world because it represents connoisseurship and, and really fine craftsmanship. And that was Gucci's calling card. I mean, and I guess this is the reason why it's still now, it's endured all these years because of that.
So the quality was absolutely kind of their marching cry. And they had this whole industrial manufacturing system that they could rely on. So it wasn't just the brands, it was the yarn makers, it was the fabric makers, it was the ready-to-wear makers who stitched up the clothes. I mean, it was this whole industrial network, and it was mostly also, they were mostly family-owned businesses. And unfortunately, in the 20 years, since I wrote the book, a lot of that sort of, textile industrial complex has been diminished because of competition from Africa and from the Far East. But still the finest products are still manufactured in Italy. But the other challenge that these companies had in kind of taking that quantum leap from being family owned brands to, mega brands, was that many of them just had one or two products and they didn't have apparel. So for example, when Don Mello comes into Gucci under Maurizio and they're trying to break into the fashion sort of scene, and nobody will come to their show because they don't have a fashion show. They just have a still presentation. So she decides to sort of reinvent the Gucci moccasin as a suede driving loafer and, beautiful jewel colors. And she gets the the shoe sizes of all the major, New York fashion journalists and sends them all shoes to try to get them to come to the presentation. But then as Gucci goes forward, and at this point it's under Tom Ford, and they start doing fashion shows, they have to come up with a look. I mean, Don used to say, you can't just send a woman out on a runway with a handbag and a pair of shoes. She's got to be dressed.
Tell people who Don Mello is, because they may not know.
So yeah, absolutely. So Don Mello was the president of Bergdorf Goodman. She had taken Bergdorf's from being kind of a fuddy-duddy old, boring department store into one of the top, edgy, sort of cutting edge fashion, retailers in New York. And the way that she did that, when she started doing that, she found out that many of the top French brands, which were kind of in vogue at that time, they all had exclusives with her competitors, Neiman Marcus and Saks and Bloomingdale's, and they wouldn't sell to her. And so she had to figure out how is she going to get really good brands into Bergdorf's. And she started buying the Italian brands. And she was really instrumental in launching Italian fashion in the United States through Bergdorf's. And when Maurizio then, wrested control of Gucci and wanted to turn it around, he thought she was going to be the perfect person to be his creative director and help him turn around Gucci. So he kind of brought her in against her will initially. She didn't really want to go. She had her, corner office overlooking Central Park and was very happy. But he presented her with such an exciting, prospect that she couldn't say no. So there she
was around when? That was around 1990 or so?
That was in the late 1990s. So, late 1980s.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And she came with them when she came with Tom Ford, correct?
And then she hired first Richard Lambertson, who started redesigning the accessories, and then she brought in Tom Ford. Initially, he came in as the knitwear designer. He kind of had a very narrow brief. And then as this turnaround starts to struggle and people start to leave, Tom Ford starts taking over more and more of the collections until he's designing every single product himself.
Yeah, and that's when Gucci, for most of us, that's when Gucci really became a big deal in the 90s, because we saw Madonna and Gwyneth Paltrow in that velvet suit. I mean, in that whole era, and Tom Ford just turned Gucci into a global powerhouse.
Absolutely. And that first show in 1995, when he completely kind of changed the look of Gucci and made it hot and sexy and exciting. And that actually, spoiler alert, that is recreated in the movie. So those of you who even if you don't remember those years, it's a great moment in the film too.
Okay, so we get to see Tom, we get to see somebody playing Tom, and also Domenico De Sole.
Yes, so Domenico, so Domenico really has the longest arc in the story, and he was a key source because he was at many of these most of these family board meetings where they're fighting over control.
Now
and,
tell people who he is.
So Domenico De Sole was an Italian, Harvard-educated Italian, who ends up in Washington as a tax lawyer working for Patton Boggs. And it's through his work as a tax lawyer that he meets Rodolfo Gucci. This is probably in the early 80s. And Rodolfo likes him because he kind of tells things like that, so he says it like it is, sort of gives you the facts. And he hires Domenico De Sole to be his representative at these family board meetings as things start to get more contentious. So Domenico is literally at the table through much of this history. And then as things evolve, Domenico becomes the president of Gucci America and is also involved in sort of relaunching Gucci with Maurizio. And the two businesses were kind of split. There was Gucci America and there was Gucci SPA, which was the Italian company. And then Domenico ends up, as Maurizio is forced out, becomes the CEO of the new Gucci, and with Tom Ford relaunches Gucci in late 90s, early 2000s.
Now during all this, we hear about all these Gucci family members, and they're all in the movie. Al Pacino plays one, Jared Leto plays one. So where all this squabbling among all the Gucci family. So give us a sense of how all of them got involved in the business. They were brothers, they were cousins. So tell us about that.
So one of the reasons I believe that this family was so contentious was that it kind of goes back to the shareholding structure and, very sort of specific figures, that there's always money and power behind these kinds of family fights. So, the founder is Gucci, and there's a family tree in my book. So that's really helpful. People have told me as they're reading, they kind of lose track who's who. Go back to the family tree. So Gucci is the founder. And then he has several sons, but the two ones that end up controlling the business are Aldo and Rodolfo. So Aldo is the kind of the marketer, the charismatic, the expander. He's the one who really kind of brings Gucci to the US, to New York, to Los Angeles. I mean, he opened the first Gucci store in Rodeo Drive before Rodeo Drive was even paved, and became an anchor for all the brands that came later. And Rodolfo is sort of the head of Gucci in Milan. He was a silent movie actor. He didn't really want to be involved in the business, very patrician, elegant, reserved. And he has one son who's Maurizio. But Aldo has three sons, so Paolo, Giorgio, and Roberto. So here you have this imbalance right away. So 50% from Aldo and three sons, 50% from Rodolfo and one son. And so this sort of disequilibrium is, I think, really kind of the fire that makes all of these battles start.
Okay, so there are a lot of Gucci's who are all having something to do with it. Now, who was the actual designer? Who was the one who came up with all the designs, the red and green, the horse bit? Who did that? Who was the—
So the initial designer was actually Aldo, and I would call him more of a marketer than a designer, because he understood that Gucci needed to have sort of codes to be recognizable. And he was the one who initially created the GG logo, because before the GG logo, and actually I was just in Florence in September to visit the Gucci archive, which has recently been reopened, and they have a traveling case with the precursor to the Gucci, the GG logo, and it was just like a straw-colored, hemp fabric background with little brown intersecting diamonds, but there were no initials. And it was Aldo who said, "No, we got to personalize this. We got to put the GG," and it was for Gucci. Then he decides that they need a better story. So he comes up with the story that they were saddlers to the nobles in sort of medieval Florence. And this is completely not true. I mean, Gucci's parents had a straw hat making factory that came from very humble origins, but he wanted a little more cachet. So he comes up with the red and green stripe and all the writing, the horse bit, the crops, the girth belt, and that's kind of his answer to how to sort of give Gucci cachet. So he was kind of one of the first marketing geniuses before marketing was even a thing.
Okay, so as always in fashion, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, right?
Right. Yeah, they have to come up with a story to tell you why you need something you already have, right?
Yeah, but it really was, it's a classy symbol and a look that has stayed really current. And now we're looking at Gucci now, and it's like logo-rama. And it's, and Alessandro Michel, who's the current designer at Gucci, has really just parlayed that logo into everything. And it doesn't look tacky. I mean, he's really given it a real sense of flair, and it's really something that a lot of the young people have jumped on because they like that they can mix and match, and there's something for everybody. Have you talked to him during
Alessandro? Yes, actually, I met with him in Milan in September when they were kind of presenting a lot of their iconic and sort of vintage pieces. And they had a display in Milan where they had, and it's on my Instagram. In fact, I wanted to sort of say, follow me on Instagram, and I have a Facebook page for the book, and I'll be putting updates there on the premiere tomorrow night and subsequent developments. And many of the pieces that they showed at this exhibit in Milan were actually pieces that you see in the movie. So there's a very iconic GG tunic that Patrizia, Lady Gaga, as Patrizia is wearing, with the leather sort of neck border and then the GG logos. And so you were asking about, the designer and who designed it. And so after Aldo kind of created these codes, Paolo really sort of envisioned himself as the designer in the 70s and 80s who was going to give Gucci new life. And that is really played out in the film. And that's sort of the source of a lot more conflict, because Aldo and Rodolfo didn't really like Paolo's designs, and they didn't think he was a talented designer. And he started going his own way. He felt frustrated and felt, muzzled. And so he started doing his own line and his own presentation. And then the family sued him for trademark infringement. So you really get into these core questions of, how do you protect the trademark of a brand, and how do you manage kind of warring family members who have different visions of what the brand should be?
Mm-hmm. Well, now, did they ever have like a CEO who was the person who was the decider, or was that ended up being Maurizio, right?
No, see, that wasn't, Maurizio ended up doing that, but it was, at the cost of forcing out his relatives. And I think, one of the reasons I was interested in the Gucci story is that I think it's kind of the most extreme and dramatic symbol of how so many companies were involved in this kind of trying to make this quantum leap into a more modern era, into an era where you have external management, where you have expertise. Look at Gucci today. It's managed by Marco Bizzarri, who is an extremely seasoned fashion and luxury good executive. Well, you didn't have these people back then. It was just the family trying to figure it out. And they really, Maurizio studied to be a lawyer. They really had no training. There was no such thing as like a luxury MBA, which is very popular now.
Yeah, well, this is a thing that a lot of people don't realize, that in these family businesses, you got a job because that was your last name. You were Gucci, so they brought you on in. And, people wanted to like learn as they go. But as you said, there wasn't that kind of expertise. And also, these were not, really big global multi-billion-dollar empires at that time. I mean, what we're looking at now is a lot more sophisticated. And that's the other thing, I'm just hopping around here, but it also begs the question, do you think, Sara, that Gucci had the up and down, and then, obviously Tom Ford turned it into something else. And now under Alessandro, it is huge. I mean, I think their annual sales are something like $10 billion. It's one of the top, among the top luxury brands. You're talking about Louis Vuitton, Chanel, and Hermes, and Gucci's right up there with them. Do you think it'll stay there now? Or do you think that now with the professional management and this global empire, what do you think?
Well, I think that it's absolutely phenomenal what they've accomplished. And I think that with actually the centennial, the re-emphasis on the book, which is telling the history, and the fashion show, which actually I want to ask you to describe a little bit about. Gucci has, for the first time, really kind of integrated its past with its present and its future. And it's embraced all the codes, it's embraced its story. It has a story, and I do think even though this is a tragic story, I think it's important for brands to have a story, and to give people inspiration, because otherwise they're just selling another pair of another handbag or another pair of shoes. At the same time, I think it's a constant challenge for these brands to find relevance and to find ways to touch people and to move people. And Alessandro Michele has been there since 2015. He's done a phenomenal job. He's really lit a fire. He's attracted in a whole new demographic of customer, which is the younger consumer. And I would actually think it would be great to hear from you, like what your impressions were of this like blowout blockbuster fashion show in LA, where they closed down Hollywood Boulevard and like filled it with stars and all the references from the past. So it was really quite a phenomenal event.
Yeah, well, the thing is, as I said, 2021 is the year of Gucci, and all of this is just a confluence of events, because obviously they had no idea that the movie was going to come out at this particular time, but this is their 100th anniversary. And so the corporation decided they were going to do a big blowout in Hollywood, because, Gucci has always had this celebrity in Hollywood image. And so this is Alessandro's idea. So they shut down Hollywood Boulevard. Now, this is where, all the stars on the parade of stars, everything. I mean, it was phenomenal. They shut down the entire block. And this is in front of Grauman's Theater. And what they did is they lined up director's chairs that were on either side of the street. And they had maybe like 500 guests. I just happened to be in California at that time because my sister has moved out there recently. And so I decided, when I found out the show was going to be happening, I decided to plan a trip around that show. And I'm really glad I did, because it was really phenomenal. Alessandro showed 100 Gucci looks. And in fact, one of those looks, that purple gown that we saw Lady Gaga wear at the premiere, was one of the gowns that was in the fashion show. So the models walked all the way down the street and back. I mean, it was something else. Incredible security there. And then afterwards, there was an after party at the Roosevelt Hotel with 3 DJs, and we partied. It was so fun. Everybody was there. Gwyneth Paltrow. We saw Diane Keaton. Jared Leto was there, and it was just, it was magnificent. A lot of fun. Serena Williams. And it was just, and a lot of fashion editors from all over the world showed up for this. But it was really a celebration of Gucci, and a way of really of just establishing, reminding people that they are in the zone. They're at the top of the mountain, and now this movie comes out. So it just is a confluence of events.
So I guess the question is, can they keep that excitement going, and what does it take? I mean, it's hard to match this level of intensity right now. So like, what are they going to do next year when nobody's, thinking about the centennial of the movie?
Yeah, but I think as you know, I mean, they are now in such a groove. I mean, it's a global brand and they have incredible reach. I was talking to one of the executives there and he was telling me that during the pandemic, when nobody was shopping, the Gucci brand, people were shopping online. A lot of the Gucci trinkets were really considered really popular for graduation gifts. So the brand continued even during the shutdown when everybody was at home. Gucci was still selling. So they really have figured it out. And obviously they've got the hot hand with this designer who really does have, he has that feeling and knows what to do. But I think at this point now, when you're talking about $10 billion in sales, we're talking about annual sales. We're talking about something that you've got products across every category. And, they can keep this going for a long time. And look at what Chanel has done. Look at Louis Vuitton. So, I can see this is just going on and on.
I did some of my premier garb shopping at the Gucci store in Washington, D.C., which we didn't have a Gucci store for years in Washington, D.C. It was out on the Maryland border. And she said that as soon as the lockdown started lifting, there were lines around the block. And Washington is not known as being a big fashion town, but there were people standing around the block to buy Gucci.
Gucci has a cool factor again, and that's incredible. But let's get back to the book here, because Sara, as we were both talking about how hard it is to write a book, I remember I took a 2-year leave to write The End of Fashion. And how long did it take you to write this?
Yeah, I took a 2-year leave too. And it was actually about 18 months between the research and the writing. And bear in mind that in addition to that, while I was actually working on the book, 2 big things happened that I had to kind of cover as they were developing. And one was the takeover battle between Bernard Arnault, LVMH, who started buying up shares in Gucci, and then the sort of rescue by Francois Pinault, whose group owns the brand today. So that takeover battle was happening while I was writing the book. So I was researching the history and interviewing people about the past. And then I was also keeping my eye on the headlines and interviewing people about the takeover battle. And then in, I think it was May of 1988, when I started, 1998, the trial started. So, and the trial ran for 5 months, and they were in court 3 times a week. And I was in court for most of the trial because I wanted to make sure that I had firsthand, impressions of who was saying what and what the reactions were and how the testimony was going. And so that went from May to November. So there was a lot.
All in Italian too. All in Italian.
All in Italian. Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah. And I tell people one of the sort of sinister things about covering that trial was that in most of the Italian courtrooms, and this was in a big, fascist era building in the heart of Milan, which was the courthouse, and big courtroom because there was tons of media. And because of the mafia trials, every courtroom has at least 1 or 2 cages where they used to put the mafia defendants because they didn't want them to get away. So you're sitting in this courtroom and it's open seating. Obviously, just like in American court, the defendants and their lawyers are sitting in the front, and then those are their assistants, and sort of the files go back. But in the back of the courtroom, there were 2 cages, and in one of them was the killer and the man who drove the getaway car, and then the other one was open. And it was such an overflow courtroom that often the journalists ended up sitting in the other cage. So I often spent a lot of days sitting in that cage. Open, of course.
Now, was Patrizia, was she there?
Yes. All the time? She came most of the time, not for the initial preliminaries, but after that, she was in court also every day, or, there's 3 days a week. Mm-hmm. And, some days she was doing well, other days she wasn't feeling well. Often there was a nurse in the courtroom who was there to give her medication if she needed it. And her daughters were there often, and her mother also was often there.
I'm curious, did they allow her to get dressed up? Or did she look, she didn't have on prison clothes, but how did she look?
It depended. Sometimes she wore suits. I remember her in a very, kind of sober blue pinstripe suit. Mm-hmm. Sometimes she wore a more casual garb. When the day she testified, she wore a lemon green, very sharp suit. Mm-hmm.
Oh, so she did speak.
She did. Yes, she did. She gave a personal statement and she also answered questions. She was under interrogation and cross-examination.
Wow. Yeah, I'm looking at the time and I think we're going to get ready to start bringing in questions. So please, everybody, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box, I think. And one of our moderators is going to be here to join us so we can bring you guys in and you can ask some questions of Sara.
And while you're thinking of questions, I just wanted to share this just in. I just got the first Italian edition of The House of Gucci. It's published by Garzanti. And I know you may not all speak Italian, but this is very exciting to me because there was no Italian edition the first time around, and I never understood why, whether it was that there was opposition or they felt the story had been kind of overexposed in the press. But it's very exciting because I wrote the book really for both an Italian and an American audience. And so I'm super excited. And it was actually flagged on the big Sunday night talk show in Italy after Lady Gaga went to the Milan premiere on Saturday. And she came on the show and she actually told the interviewer that even though she hasn't read it herself because she wanted to kind of do her own research process and come to terms with Patrizia by herself, she said she's heard it's a good book. So that was great.
Yeah, she'll get around to reading. So how many languages has it been translated in, Sara?
So it's actually been being translated into about a dozen languages as we speak. There's been huge interest in the story globally. It's really it's incredible to me how much of a global phenomenon this is.
Well, the thing is that people are fascinated about not just the fashion and what it looks like, but also the business of fashion. And this is the reason why, I'm going to make a plea for everybody. If you haven't read this book, I mean, first thing is this, you'll love the business part, but also it reads like a novel. So it's really fun. And, even if you read it before the movie or after the movie, obviously, when Hollywood steps in and does a movie, then everywhere wants to read like, well, what did they leave out or what did they add or whatever. So the thing is that this is now your chance to get the book and to read it and get all, get the real story, all the detail and fun facts. And it's also really a lot funny too. I mean, because so many comical things happen.
Yeah, it is. In fact, a lot of the film, people are, Ridley Scott even talks about it as being a satire. And I don't know if it's completely satirical, but there certainly are moments of levity and of comedy. And it's just these people are kind of larger than life.
Okay, so anyway, Kelsey, we have some questions we can start?
Yes, we do. We have plenty of questions coming in. First I want to go and ask you more personal questions. And this kind of should be open to both of you. Was there one specific thing or what was it that made you become a fashion expert and really follow the news and, follow the the fashion industry? Do you want us to start, Teri?
Well, for me, I wanted to be a reporter since I was 13 years old. And I actually started out at the junior high school newspaper. I did a fashion column called Teri's Tips for Fashion Flair. So it's really funny that I ended up many years later doing this. But I just wanted, starting at the Wall Street Journal in '84, I covered the courthouse when Giuliani was the US attorney. I covered airlines for several years. And I didn't really start covering developing the fashion beat until around 1990. But it was, for me, really challenging because the Wall Street Journal at that time was a 2-section newspaper that we didn't have color pictures. And we were writing to businessmen and investors, and a lot of companies weren't public at that time. So it was a challenge to figure out how to make these stories exciting for men and people who really didn't think they were interested in fashion to read them. But, stories are always about people, which make the stories a lot more fun to read about. You want to know about people and their money. And of course, we all are interested in clothes, which makes us all experts. And so, I just took it from there.
And in my case, I wanted to be a business correspondent, but I actually, like you said, I wanted to really write about people, but I thought nobody would pay me a decent wage to write about sort of personality profiles. So I thought, well, I'm going to write about business, but I'm going to go focus on the stories where the people are really the interesting story. And I decided to focus on Milan because I had done my master's in Bologna and I spoke Italian and I had the vocabulary, like the business and economic context. And I was working for Dow Jones at the time. So we were kind of like the wire service to the Wall Street Journal. And I was doing a lot of stories that were kind of giving me good experience, but they weren't really that compelling. It was, the dollar, there were a lot of market comment kind of reports in the dollar and the oil market and the stock market. And I started thinking more long term, and I thought, well, who's really going to care about the Milan stock market, at the end of the day? And who's really going to care about what the dollar is doing in, whatever year it was, in 1988, 1989. And then at the same time, I realized that the big booming emerging business in Milan was the fashion industry. And there were really interesting stories, and people really were curious about what Giorgio Armani was doing and how he was growing his business and how he was competing with Versace. And I thought, oh, well, here, there's just a wealth of people stories and their brand stories, and they've got a really great product. And so I started covering the fashion industry from a business perspective.
That's actually really interesting. And I know we have a number of small business owners and entrepreneurs that attend our programs. And you've had them peppered throughout your talk. I've been catching them, the lessons learned or things that businesses and entrepreneurs should be thinking of. But if there's one key takeaway message for the business professional, what would you say this book would, what is that one takeaway for those people?
So to me, it's really about the ability to combine a vision. And that's why Maurizio was important, because he had a vision and he was absolutely set that was what he was trying to achieve, and he wasn't compromising. So you have to have a vision, and then you have to have dedication to that vision. But at the same time, you have to have the ability to execute and the ability to support that vision. So Maurizio, in his case, he overspent and overreached and wasn't able to sustain the vision. So you have to either have the ability to do that yourself, or you have to have people who are around you who are supporting you, who can help you do that.
Gotcha. We have a few people in the audience interested to know, how closely are you still following the Gucci family? And do you have any interest in maybe writing a sequel that follows the story of Gucci post-murder, as well as Patrizia's lawsuits against her own daughters?
I did an update for this movie tie-in edition that you just shared. It's the new afterword. I also narrate it on the audiobook. And that really gives you the highlights of what's happened, both of the Gucci family and the Gucci business over the past 20 years since I wrote the book. That shows me that this story, this saga, is continuing today. As you mentioned, the daughters have been, pursued legal action against the mother. So I think there could definitely be scope for a sequel. I think there could be scope for a television series. I feel like the story can live on. I'm actually publishing an article tomorrow morning for Bloomberg Business Week, which revisits Maurizio Gucci's legacy. And there's a surprise. So an untold chapter that was not in the book. So you can, look tomorrow morning follow my Twitter and my Facebook, and you'll see there's another wrinkle to the story.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. I'm gonna have to check that out. This is an interesting question. Were you ever nervous yourself facing any legal challenges from the family as you wrote this story?
Oh my God, I was terrified the whole time I was working on this story. And I was actually threatened by the watch manufacturer. And he was one of the most successful licenses that actually the revenue from his license actually kept the company afloat in some of its darkest days, and paid salaries and paid for fabrics and leather. And I was actually in court one day covering the trial, and my phone rings, and we had cell phones back then. There were the big Motorola brick phones. And I walked out, and I hear this raspy voice. I hadn't met him. I had actually sent him a letter asking if he would help me and if he would be interviewed about the watch license. And he said, "Ms. Forden, this is Severin Wunderman." And he said, I'm going to write the book on Gucci. And I knew Aldo and I knew the whole family and I have the story and I'm going to write the book. And I'm a very wealthy person and I'm going to finance the movie. I'm going to produce my own movie and your book is going to be nothing. And I was afraid. I was shaking in my boots and I was, I just like taken this big leap of faith. I'd taken leave of absence. I had a 3-year-old and I was just, I had to, finish this book. And it was obviously important to me that it be a success. And I knew that in publishing, it's like the first is the best and the second comer is never as successful. So that really, really shook me up. But then I realized there was nothing I could do. I had to just stick to my guns. And I just kept on going like, the tortoise and the hare. And I finished my manuscript. And in the meantime, Wunderman never published a book. And so I reported all around the watch license, talking to other people and people who had worked with him and knew him. And at the end of the process, I had distilled it into about 3 pages and I sent them off to him on a fax. And literally I had fed the last page into the fax machine and the phone rings and it's Ms. Forden, this is Severin Wunderman. So I asked him, like, I know you didn't want to be interviewed, but would you please read these pages and let me know if there's anything that's really wrong or if you want to clarify. And he says, I give you 2 options, the next weekend in my chateau at the south of France or the weekend after in my townhouse in London. So I took him up on the townhouse in London and I ended up having like a 6-hour interview with him. And he was an amazing person and he could have written a book just about his life story. So it was quite incredible.
Wow. But, at the end, it's a really important story to tell. So it's great that you stuck through it and published the book. That's really great. Some people in the audience are really interested in knowing, have you ever spoken with Patrizia after her prison release in 2016 at all? Or what kind of life is she living now? Is it a quiet life? Is she out there?
So I've requested to speak with her. As I said, the prison authorities never let me speak with her. I was actually in Milan in September and I reached out. She is now under a court-appointed supervisor because her mother, before she died, thought that she was vulnerable to being exploited by people. So they decided she had given some interviews to the Italian press, which are actually a bit devastating. And so now her lawyers and this court-appointed administrator have decided to deny her any interview opportunities. So I wasn't able to speak with her. But just from following what I read in the Italian press, I think she's somewhat isolated. I mean, she's living in, her mother passed, her daughters live in Switzerland. She has some friends she's seen around the streets of Milan. The paparazzi, when they see her, they kind of swarm her and ask her questions. So it's a very different life from the one that's depicted in the movie.
And Barb in the audience was really excited that Lady Gaga was selected to portray her in the film. And she had a question, how much do you know about Lady Gaga's, do you know anything about how she slipped into the role or her process or her method for becoming Patrizia?
She's given some great interviews about that. So I would refer you to those where she talks about how she researched like the accents of Vignola, which is the area where Patrizia was from. She's done a lot of work there.
Great. And then this is a final question before we wrap up for this evening. William wants to know, have you ever been to the restaurant Babel's? I hope I said that right. Where Maurizio, I'm awful at Italian accents, I'm sorry. Where Maurizio and Luigi would eat steak Florentine.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because I have, and one of the key people that I wanted to interview in the book was Luigi. And he was probably the person who spent the most time with Maurizio of anybody. And finally, towards the end of my research, he agreed to be interviewed and we met at Babel's. And this was after Maurizio had been killed. And it's in the epilogue. So it's in the red cover book, but it's also in the movie tie-in. And we're, at Babel's, we're having lunch, I'm interviewing him and I'm looking at him and I'm thinking there's something really familiar about him. And I realize he's wearing Maurizio's aviator glasses.
Oh, wow.
Well, want to say to both of you, Sarah and Teri, thank you so much this evening. I learned so much about not only the Gucci family and their history, but also just the world of fashion too. And I'm really looking forward to this movie release. And for those of you who haven't, there's so much more information in this book that we're not touching upon today. I mean, there's just so much information from the business aspects, the family. I highly recommend picking up a copy of House of Gucci. You can from our local bookstore. You can at any box store. You can pick it up from the library.
Exactly.
So thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you, your listeners. And as I said, follow me on Instagram. My website is Sara Gay Forden. You can also send me questions through there. And I hope you enjoy the book if you haven't read it already.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks, Sarah. Good luck.
Thanks, Teri. Thanks, Kelsey.